Hello, I'm Dex Gelfand, and I'm going to call this talk How and What Your Scientologist Friend, Neighbor, Co-worker, etc. is indoctrinated to think, feel, and react. See, I have had a previous background as an indoctrinated Scientologist. So I know of what I speak, and perhaps I feel a certain responsibility, having once been a part of that mindset and having previously promoted or disseminated those things. Perhaps I feel a little obligation or responsibility to set the record straight and help you to avoid the pitfalls of engaging in activities within the Church of Scientology. I would put quotation marks around the word church. So anyway, it is all the brand of one L. Ron Hubbard, was a very prolific science fiction writer in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and into the 50s, and occasionally thereafter. Prolific is a good word because he was never at a loss for words. As he used to explain back in the early days of writing Westerns and science fiction, that you got paid a penny a word, so he used a lot of words. And he started out writing Westerns as they were the popular theme. And then when science fiction became more popular, in his own explanation, he wrote Westerns that took place in outer space with aliens and ray guns. But anyway, he was never at a loss for words. And he came up with the initial book, Dianetics, which came out in 1950. And it could be said to be reworked psychology. It's basically saying things that have been known for 100 years before, that are longer. That we are impacted by trauma. That trauma impacts our consciousness, our viewpoint, our attitudes and behaviors and feelings. He presented this as a startling new discovery that eclipsed the world of psychology and psychiatry. It wasn't anything like that. It was an interesting codified approach to try to process and resolve trauma, painful experiences. He borrowed from various sources of information, as he would continue to do throughout his existence, and put his own name on it and claim to have come up with everything by himself. But there isn't much that I can see from all of my research through the history of Scientology and all its development that actually originated in him. Now, Dianetics took a very, as I said, codified approach to finding these moments of what he called pain and unconsciousness, what he labeled engrams. And in the concepts and paradigm that he put forth, he referred to people as having an analytical mind, which was, I guess you could say, your consciousness and the analyzing part of you, and the reactive mind, which is where all the pain and unconsciousness and automatic attitudes and behaviors emanated from. And he very emphatically rejected any association with the psychology terms of unconscious or subconscious mind, despite the fact that if you had familiarity with these things, you couldn't help but notice that he was speaking in essentially the same concepts, as much as he denied it, as much as he was very hostile and battled against the ideas of psychology or psychiatry, as much as he was very hostile towards the idea of any other or previous view of the mind or of healing the trauma of the mind. But it really wasn't much that was all that new. And the Dianetics book, when it came out, was popular. And he made some very grandiose claims. Hubbard was never short for hyperbole. He claimed that this reactive mind, the way he described it, in my words, it was like he was saying that it was like a container of all the pain, unconsciousness, and bad feelings and emotions and attitudes, and that you could drain it, essentially, by running a person through processing, through gaining consciousness of traumatic moments, and that there would be some, he called these moments, these recordings of these moments, Engrams, and that there would be some basic engram that all the other ones were rooted in, that through all this processing of maybe a few hundred hours in his estimation, you would eventually pull the plug on this entire container of bad feelings and attitudes, and there would be no more reactive mind, when we got what he called the basic engram. It's a grand theory. That's not how it works at all. But that was the path he set everyone on who got involved in Dianetics, in search of this basic engram. He made various hyperbolic claims for the accomplishment of this in a person, that they would achieve what he called the state of clear. And he would say, in the book, you can see clears never get sick. Clears have an eidetic memory. They remember everything always. They are never unhappy. They are never subject to any sort of discomfort or any misbehaviors. He would modify this through the years to try to explain how he was still right, but other factors were getting in the way. He failed miserably in an early demonstration, early in the 1950s, when he went in front of an audience on a stage and presented a woman as being clear. And to demonstrate her clear abilities, he turned his back to her and then asked her to tell the audience what the color of his tie was. She could not. But that was the idea, was that through all this work of applying his technique, one could arrive at in Christian terms, it might be called a state of grace. Other terms for this throughout religion and philosophy. But this idea of occasionally being above all misbehaviors, all bad attitudes, all wrong reactions, and so forth. Of course, this is describing being godlike, and well, as far as we all can tell, that's not really achievable. But this was the promise of Dianetics. As the subject grew and Hubbard came under attack for various reasons, for abusive treatment of people, for his autocratic control of his organizations, for his incredible, he used his organizations as his personal piggy bank and bankrupted them. And, through the years, people would get heavily involved and then leave. And Hubbard would come under attack from his attacks on the fields of psychology and psychiatry, as well as their questioning, his hyperbole, and his dismissal, his hostile dismissal, his accusatory attitudes of how horrible any other approach to mental or emotional healing was. He made a lot of trouble for himself. And one of the issues he didn't like to deal with was having to pay taxes. So he moved towards labeling his brand as a religion and called it Scientology. And a lot of what he borrowed from came from Aleister Crowley, who was practiced in what I guess would be called black magic in the 1920s and forward, and had some very interesting techniques. And the basic overall principle of Crowley was, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And that's kind of how Hubbard lived. But anyway, as Hubbard gained his own little flock, people working with him, developing techniques and so forth, which he would always eventually claim to have done all by himself. Okay, he developed what was called, he called it a bridge or a grade chart, which was a pro forma generic series of techniques assembled in levels, so to speak, quote unquote, around the word levels. People are suckers for the idea of levels. We are suckers for the idea of being better than other people, better than somebody else, which is a very defensive attitude to take to try and cope with or deal with our own anxieties and insecurities. So that idea of being better than everybody else certainly has its attraction, but in truth, the only betterment that is credible or relevant is a betterment within yourself, better than you were, closer to the way you want to be. And anyway, if the idea of being better than everybody else, being promoted as accomplishable only through this means strikes a nerve or rings a bell, it's because, well, in cults and religions, isn't that always a bit of the indoctrination? We are the only ones with the true knowledge and the true way. But in Scientology, they took a much more emphatic and aggressive attitude about this. And so this grade chart or bridge was developed. And of course, through the years, when people would supposedly have attained this mythical state of clear, this brings about a lot of what you could call cognitive dissonance within a person, questioning themselves, have they just got everything wrong? Because they still have their anxieties, many of them. They still have their self-doubts. They still recognize a lot of misbehavior and bad attitudes and things they wish they hadn't done, and ways they can be sometimes that they are not proud of. So this cognitive dissonance is something that every Scientologist quietly lives with. In the world of Scientology, it's considered sort of a sin, a transgression. It's unacceptable to say, well, I did this and achieved this level, but I still have all these problems, and I really don't exhibit, I don't feel that I have the abilities that I should have from this, really. That's considered, in Scientology terms, out public relations, out PR, which simply means you're bad-mouthing all this great stuff, and that's not acceptable, and it gets you in a lot of trouble. So Scientologists have to hold in their cognitive dissonance. And then as the years came and went, and Scientology and Dianetics ebbed and flowed, I think mostly needing more stuff to sell his customers, because after Clear, what then? Especially since Clear, the supposed state of Clear, just never measured up to anything Hubbard said it would, because it couldn't. He came up with higher levels, and he called these OT levels, operating thetan. Thetan being Scientology's word for spirit or spiritual being, Thetan. Draw your own conclusions about that word and that concept. But then Hubbard came up with these OT levels. Now, number one, this provided more income. In my words, Hubbard wanted to keep the hamsters on the wheels. He had been being very autocratic and dictatorial. It would be in Scientology. It developed around 1965 that you would not be tolerated or accepted if you in any way engaged with or remained involved with anyone who was anti-Hubbard or anti-Scientology, or developed or promoted their own spiritual ideas or practice, anyone or anything that could take somebody away from worshiping Hubbard and trusting him and only him. You had to be dismissive of every other idea. In fact, in Scientology, it was published that the state of being open-minded was a sort of a mental disease. and that's just how indoctrinated you had to be. The idea of being open to any thoughts that transcended or contradicted anything Hubbard said or wrote was something to be detested. Well, isn't that how a cult works? Well, with these operating thetan levels of practices that a person would be brought through, the idea was that you would gain godlike abilities. And isn't that attractive? Doesn't that sound attractive? Very notably, what he called operating thetan level 3, OT3, in which he gave quite an incredible story from his science fiction writer background. Had to do with an alien overlord trillions of years ago who dominated and subjugated and imprisoned all the people as spiritual beings, and somehow using H-bombs, because at the time of Hubbard's creating this, H-bombs were the most ferocious, powerful thing in the world, so he drew from that. If you look at Hubbard's writing, it's always, reflective of the times, even though he may be talking about things that he claims happened millions and billions of years ago. He relates them as having within the context of the technology of the times. So it involved some alien overlord using H-bombs to imprison people in their spiritual being state as tiny little encapsulated, almost like insects that infested all of us. The idea being that we are infested with just thousands of H-bombed subjugated beings, and that every bad feeling and thought we have after supposedly having attained this state of clear is because of these beings, what Hubbard called body thetans, or entities. And so you were led to discover each and every thought and feeling that was undesirable and identify it as not yourself, but some other being that you were, through this processing, supposed to sort of liberate them to go return to full beinghood away from you. And there are various separate levels of accomplishing this in Scientology's upper levels, quote unquote. And this is what Scientologists are indoctrinated to believe in. And I know for a lot of people who invested hundreds of thousands of dollars and decades only to do these, and these things were all confidential in Scientology. You're not allowed to talk about it, which you can understand why, because you'd be ridiculed, and people might even get you to come to your senses and say, how ridiculous is that? Which I'm sure must have happened some of the time anyway. And from what I've learned, that was the breaking point for a lot of Scientologists when they opened this thing up and saw this is what they were supposed to have within them, and this was supposedly what they needed to process within themselves. A lot of people did break away right at that point and said, okay, I can only suppress my consciousness and all the red flags that are going off so much, but this goes beyond that. Okay, this burst the bubble. This is the straw that breaks the camel's back, and a lot of people do leave at that point. A lot of other people feel like they must force themselves to swallow this and find a way to try and believe it's true. This is cognitive dissonance, And it creates a lot of internal pressure to spend years and years of one's life chasing after these imaginary entities. And it has a superficial air of truth and workability, because you are finding actual thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and to a slight superficial degree gaining consciousness and processing them, that can bring about a short temporary feeling of relief, but it's not lasting, because it's not based on what's really within you. And so it's only temporary. But this is what Scientologists are indoctrinated to accept and believe in. And Scientologists are indoctrinated to take Hubbard's attitude of great hostility towards anybody who would ridicule or argue with any of this. And as I said, within any cult or religion, there's an imbued, enforced, indoctrinated sense of, we are the Illuminati. We are the ones who really know. We're the only people who really know what's going on. And there's a cosmology that goes with that, of alien races through the trillennia who are really dominating and controlling the beings on this planet, and we're the only ones who really know the score on what's going on, and everybody else is living in their own self-delusional matrix, which, ironically, doesn't that seem to describe the world of a Scientologist? And so there's built into this a lot of defensiveness, a lot of hostility, a lot of holier than thou, and without a doubt, because of just who we are and what we cannot suppress within ourselves, just the feeling of just how humiliated and unaccepted we would be, those of us speaking from the Scientologist viewpoint, if people were to discover the things we believe and how we feel about everybody who doesn't, quote unquote, know what we know. And this is what every Scientologist lives with. They all have the hope and the idea that maybe someday you and the rest of the world will become enlightened like them, as Scientology grows to take over this world, and in Hubbard's indoctrinated expressions, then move on to bring Scientology to other planets. Yeah, that's the story, and that's how Scientologists are indoctrinated to feel and act, and what they are indoctrinated to believe. And I don't say this with a sense of really wanting to ridicule those people who are stuck in their own prison of belief. The word prison of belief in the book by Lawrence Wright, it's a very well chosen phrase, because as I've been describing, after a little while of investing yourself so much into this, to the point where you've agreed and gone along with separating yourself from and being unaccepting of your friends and your family who disagree with you, and you put yourself out on that limb that far, you kind of feel like, having invested yourself in it that way and taken such a stance, that you must stick to it and defend it, or else feel and look like a fool. That's a lot of the motivation that keeps somebody in line and staying with this for many, many years after the red flags arise in their minds. But, I just think of it as, I once believed in much of this, and I try to look at these people as just being at a different point on their learning curve. And, I believe that at heart, like anybody else, these are basically good people. They've just kind of sold their souls bit by bit as the indoctrination went on and on. But I think that we should always try to make it easier for such a person to gracefully backpedal, and to know that we still love and accept them, even though we can't possibly support or encourage such involvement. And of course, there's the really dark side, which is all the terrible abuses and the way Scientology takes over one's mind, or I should say the way Scientologists allow this to take place. But you won't find in all the hundreds of thousands of published words by Hubbard, and he's incredibly prolific. You won't find much said about love or God or empathy or forgiveness. No. These concepts, these basic truths of existence, would not lead someone to continue to invest themselves in the hostile, unaccepting attitudes of Scientology, in which loyalty to the man at the top is everything. Everything is excused. The ends justify the means, in that Scientology must be forwarded for, quote unquote, the good of the planet. It's a tough line for a Scientologist to work, and there's, without a doubt, quite a bit of struggle within such a person, of cognitive dissonance. Scientologists are indoctrinated in Scientology explanations of what's wrong with everybody else, that they've been infected and subverted by the evil psychiatrists and the secret alien races that secretly run and control everything. Yeah, that is part of the indoctrination of Scientology. So I believe in trying to make it easier for people to step out of that, to make them feel accepted and loved without supporting or encouraging such attitudes, such thinking, and investment in a group that has thousands of people disassociating from their children, their parents, their spouses, and being in a state of denial of all love and empathy for someone whose opinions and statements contradict the forward path of Scientology. You could look at Tom Cruise. You could look at people you've heard of and know of. You can look up plenty of things online. But it ultimately is a very, very dark road. Anyway, that's my summation for now of Scientology attitudes. What your Scientologist friend, relative, coworker, neighbor, what they believe, how they think, and why.